Hi, Redditors, I have a little confession to make. I cheated on my husband of 3 years when he was away on a business trip. I didn't mean to, and now I don't know what to do. So I thought to come on here to ask for advice. I very much still loved my husband, but sometimes he didn't give me the attention I want. Even before we got married, it was always his business first. Business this, business that. He claimed he was trying to make money for my betterment, but I didn't see it as that. I saw it as him be thoughtless and neglectful. My husband could travel for weeks on end, only popping by for a few days to see me before taking off again to his next business meeting. And the funny thing was they had always been around the world. None of them had been at our home base. Normally, questions would pop in your head about the weirdness of the trips, right? I mean, had you all been in my shoes, you would have had doubts that something was going. Even if you didn't have doubts, you would surely feel lonely. Well, I had doubts, of course. I had questions. So pardon me for that. It backfired on me with my husband when I confronted him about the regularity of his business trips, and I decided to return the favor. I knew what I did was stupid, but I wasn't thinking. I was alone and had needs. And my husband was traveling round the world, probably with women at his beck and call. Back to what happened when I had confronted him about his many trips. He had just returned from one. And I threw a tantrum. I told him I was going to leave the marriage if he continued to cheat on me in the name of a trip. I was just joking at the moment, but my anger had gotten the best of me, so I had gone off like a pipe. I told him I knew he was cheating on me on his business trips and I had evidence. Well, I had been bluffing then, but my husband didn't know that, and I thought, what if he was really cheating and I was just the stay-at-home trophy wife? I was proven wrong. After all my tantrums, my husband didn't even seem to care that I was communicating about my problems and the problems of our marriage. He had just gone to sleep, and the next morning he had left on a trip by the time I had woken up. He had just called me irrelevant in so many different ways with that act. And he had even left a note saying if I left the marriage that I wouldn't smell a dime from him. That, coupled with everything, had hurt because it reminded me that I was just a disposable toy to him. I'm sure you would have retaliated if you had been in my place. So I did. Like I said, I hadn't meant to cheat on my husband, but our last fight was always in the back of my mind. And even when he came back from the trip he had disappeared on me on, he never once apologized and still continued to go on trips. We barely even spoke to each other since that day. It was just an uncomfortable silence between us, and I couldn't take it anymore. Maybe my cheating on him had been some kind of way to get his attention. I wanted him to know that he couldn't leave me and expect me to be compliant with it. I had to get back at him. I slept with his personal gym trainer. Before you all come at me, I had already said I didn't plan it. It just kind of happened. My husband's personal gym trainer happened to be at the house one day when my husband wasn't around, and I fell into temptation. I succumbed with the plan of revenge on the back of my mind. My husband's personal gym trainer had come by for their scheduled workout in the gym, but didn't know my husband had gone on a trip, or he had mixed up the schedule, or the fates had been out for me. Not like I was superstitious or anything. It may sound funny to you guys on here, but then I had asked the gym trainer to show me some exercises to trim my abdomen and waist. I hadn't wanted his coming all the way over to be a waste. That's how we had ended up tangled in the sheets. That's how I had cheated on my husband. My husband had come back a week later, and the guilt was building up on me like a plague. He started talking to me again and somehow began being sweet to me. My husband took me out for dinner during one of his weekends off. It was such a lovely experience. The restaurant was my favorite one in Edmond. The setting, the food, everything was just amazing, but I couldn't be at peace because of the guilt eating me up. And my husband didn't stop there. He took me out shopping. This was something he had done only a handful of times within our 3 years of marriage. It was like he knew what I had done and was sweetening me up before springing a death trap on me. I was always so scared at his every move. The cherry on the cake of my husband's turnaround was when he stayed home with me. He stayed home and was the perfect husband throughout. The guilt tripled whenever his personal gym trainer came to the house on his scheduled workout days. And those days, I couldn't breathe. I couldn't confess. My husband was finally beginning to be more like the man I had married. The man I had fallen in love with. My name is Elsa, and I'm 28 years old. My husband's name is Will, and he's 31 years old. We met when he was interning with the IT company that was opposite the Starbucks coffee shop where I had worked part-time to get money to complete my course at Oklahoma City's community college. My friends still make fun of how our meeting had been like that of a fairy tale. Our relationship was meant to be according to them. But to me, my husband and I's meeting had been corny. Sure, you all would think the same. He had come to get a coffee for his then boss, whose name was Rick, but I had somehow misinterpreted it to be Dick. So as he was approaching for his order, I had said something along the lines of "one Dick coming right up." Everyone had burst out laughing, and the embarrassment I had felt at that moment was something that should be written in books and retold for ages to come. Well, that was how my husband and I began talking. He always came in to buy coffee, and we continued seeing each other even after I left and focused on college full-time. We started dating, and he proposed a year later. My first year of being married to my husband had been wonderful. It was the sweetest year I had ever experienced in my life. I was loved and pampered and shown the world. He took me on trips, he showed me he cared, and I fell in love with him even more. The second year of my marriage to my husband was as the first, but with new adventures. The third year was when he got his job and things began to slow down, and I got into this mess of a situation. Everything was perfect. There was no need telling him, and if he had somehow found, I'll probably bluff and say he has cheated too. There was no point in bringing the cat out the bag when the sleeping dog was laying down. That would cause commotion and fights I wasn't ready to face. My husband was perfect once again. I thought all was right with the world. Our third-year wedding anniversary was approaching, and my husband decided we would travel to a nice out-of-town hotel to celebrate it. We got to the hotel, checked into our rooms, and had a rest. We then woke up for our romantic dinner, and that's when the magical bubble I had been living in for a while burst. My husband started getting text notifications throughout the entire dinner. He had claimed it was work, but something about his attitude was off-putting and weird. He stayed on his phone all night replying to each text notification without even minding he was in the presence of my company. If maybe the whole dinner and princess treatment has been to sweeten me up for the wrongs he was about to do, I wouldn't know, but I was pissed at that very moment. Once again, I had become irrelevant and inconsequential and small. I didn't know what to do, so I sat there the whole dinner. But the guilt was still there. So do you guys think I should come clean and allow him probably treat me worse than he has been doing, or do you think I should stay quiet? Update 2. After my husband dropped me off at home and traveled for another 2 weeks or so, I cheated again. It was premeditated. This time I had meant to, and it was with his personal trainer again. He had showed me care whenever he came by to check if my husband was in. Well, I had thought several times that he could have just called my husband to ask if he was around instead of coming by the house. But he had done it for me. He saw how lonely I felt and decided to be coming by on my husband's training days, and one day we slept with each other again. He was there when my husband wasn't, and I had never felt so at ease in my life. I know you all had been expecting me to come clean to my husband since my last Reddit update, but what he didn't know wouldn't hurt him. And there was this fear when of telling my husband all what had happened. He would definitely do something drastic. So I didn't tell him, and I continued sleeping with my husband's personal trainer. My husband hadn't shown for more than 2 weeks, and I began to panic. No one had heard from him. At first I had thought he had been avoiding me, but then he hadn't been in touch with his family either. That's when I started to panic, and the call from the hospital came a while later. My husband had been hospitalized for a week now and didn't want to see anyone. I rushed to the hospital then and found my husband. The good news was that he was already recovering. The bad news was that he had to stop all his travels. My husband began staying in the house because of the doctor's orders. This had been what I had always wanted, but I was in trouble with my husband's personal gym trainer. The delusional man thought that I and him were supposedly exclusive, and I was getting a divorce from my husband. Could you imagine the audacity? My husband probably gave him free rein over the house whenever he came in for their training, and he thought he could use that to his advantage. Whenever my husband was around, his personal trainer always thought that was his opportunity to touch me. Help, guys. I didn't know what to do. I had warned him several times that it was just an affair and nothing else, and now my husband was back. I was done with him. He had just laughed. I had made a small cheating mistake with a psychopath. His advances didn't stop after my severe warnings, and my husband almost caught us one day, and I had never felt more fear as I struggled for what to say in excuse. It was one of my husband's training days as usual, and his trainer had come to the house like he owned the place. After their training session had ended, he had come into the kitchen where I was to get some water and smacked my butt as he walked to the fridge. That happened to be the same time my husband coincidentally walked into the kitchen and saw another man's hands on my ass. I had no words that day, and luckily the trainer came up with an excuse that he had seen something wrong with my dress and he just wanted to help and fix this. I think my husband had noticed something was wrong since that day, and he started asking me weird questions. Well, I lied, of course, but the good part was that my husband's gym trainer had been told to stop coming to the house. I was finally at peace from all the harassment, and my husband was at home. Although he wasn't talking to me and always looked for a reason to leave the house, I was glad that he was at least coming home. All was well in my world, or that's what I thought, until I found a picture of me in a compromising position with my husband's gym trainer in my mail. It came with a blackmail letter that said I had to deposit $100,000 into the checking account on the note or risk my husband finding out I had an affair. I was being blackmailed. I couldn't believe I was being blackmailed by that scam of a man. Just because I had felt lonely and had sought companionship, that someone from nowhere thought he had the right to be able to blackmail me. Well, he had more than the right because of how foolish I had been, but everything wasn't completely my fault and I was paying for it. Karma had come to bite me right back in my face. The threats and pictures didn't stop coming, and I got scared that my husband might just innocently go to collect the mail and find out I had done a horrible thing. I also got scared that the foolish man might start trying other means of blackmail and even confront my husband, which would be 10 times worse. My husband was my everything, my source of stability, my provider, someone who always came through for me. There was a time when he would leave everything to come and comfort me when I was having a bad day back when I was still completing my college degree. Just one phone call of me crying and he was there like he was already close by. I didn't have close family or friends, he was that for me. I didn't mean to cheat on him like I've repeated several times in the course of this narration. I didn't want to lose him. So I pulled all my strings, the little savings I had accumulated since I stopped feeding and providing for myself, and deposited in the account as the note had said, and I waited to see what else would happen. I thought everything had ended as I didn't hear anything from the blackmailer. I was wrong. Totally wrong. It turned out my blackmailer and my husband's gym trainer were one and the same person. I should have known, don't you think, Redditors? I should have seen the signs. Nope, I was blind, so blind it seemed. I found out my husband had allowed his personal gym trainer to start coming back into the house to train him. And I found out I was being blackmailed the hard way. A week or so after my husband's personal gym trainer started coming to the house, his advances started up again, and I found out a while later that he had blackmailed me. I would be passing by and he would smack my butt, sometimes he would grab me by the neck and forcefully kiss me. It was bordering on abuse, and with my husband in the same house. Like he had no respect for my husband at all. I got tired of it and confronted him. I told him to stop with his advances and warned him that I was going to tell my husband if he doesn't stop, and I learned the hard way. That's when I found out he was the blackmailer. He had told me something along the lines of "may the first person win," and told me to start prepping more money, and that he was almost running out of the stash I had given him, and his mouth didn't talk unless it's shut with money. I had never hated anybody the way I had hated him at that moment. From then, the advances grew worse. Like, my husband would literally be in the living room and I would be in the kitchen, and my husband's personal trainer would grab me and forcefully kiss me. I know you all would be wondering where my husband was in this situation, but trust me, I had told him. I had complained that his trainer was giving me a bad vibe, but he had said he didn't see anything weird about it and it was just in my head probably. I told him so many times, but it had fallen on deaf ears, so I was left to deal with it alone because I couldn't come clean and tell my husband what I had done. Like I said, the advances didn't stop and I was so close to filing a police complaint against him, but that would lead to questions. I had no friends to talk it out with. If I had, I probably wouldn't be in this situation in the first place. And my husband just wasn't ready to listen to me. Well, a bonus point was that he was finally talking to me even though it was still one-worded answers. At the moment, I knew I had done something wrong to rot this treatment, but I just didn't have the time to deal with it as I had other things occupying my mind. All because of a slip-up. Okay, not just one slip-up, I was going through a lot of stress and anxiety. I could barely sleep. I was always on the lookout in case something came in the mail, while always fighting off my husband's personal trainer's advances. He had grown so bold now as to come to the house when my husband was out and make threats. His latest threat was a request of $200,000. I didn't know where I was going to get that money from. The last blackmail has cleared all my life savings and I had next to nothing to be able to pay off this one. I was confused on so many levels that I had to stoop down to selling the jewelry my husband had given me. I had pawned off all my jewelry, and if my husband noticed, he didn't say a word. He still didn't see anything when I told him again that the vibes his personal gym trainer gave me was wrong. I mean, wasn't a husband supposed to get rid of any worries of his wife? Well, mine didn't seem to even know that something was totally wrong with me. The threats became worse and worse every time the gym trainer stopped by. He had said he needed the money in 3 days or the cat was going to let out the bag. I didn't know where else to get the money, seeing as I had no friends or family to ask, so I did a drastic move. I applied for a loan at the bank and used one of my husband's cars that he barely used for collateral. Desperate times called for desperate measures, but the situation I had stuck myself in was way below the belt. I had no way of repaying the loan, so I planned on taking my husband's car out for a drive and fake that it had gotten stolen. I didn't think it through, I know, but I had no other option coming to my mind. I just needed that scumbag off my back. I was foolish, of course. You don't need to tell me in the comments. I was utterly foolish, because how didn't I think the threats would continue if I didn't tell my husband or do something to get rid of his personal trainer? Well, I decided to do that by the third time he came around to ask for money. It hadn't even been up to 3 weeks since I had deposited the last one I had loaned from the bank, and the swine was back for the next one. It was like I was his monthly paycheck and he was having fun pulling my strings. That's when I knew this had to stop, because I was running out of options and I had no place to get his request of $300,000. I had already taken my husband's car to pawn it and get money to settle my bank loan. Thankfully, my husband hadn't placed insurance on that particular car, and somehow by my weak stroke of luck, he hadn't noticed the car was missing yet. But the swine had started making murmurs and threatening as usual. I knew I had to get rid of him when I found a picture of our night together in an envelope on my matrimonial bed. He was going way too far, and if I didn't do something immediately, he would do worse and ruin my marriage. So I planned to spoil his image in front of my husband. I started small, something he wouldn't notice that it was me doing it, and just blurt everything out to my husband. My husband's phone got missing first, and I began planting ideas in my husband's head that it was him. After all, he was the only person we allowed into the house. I made sure to always have something of my husband go missing only when his personal trainer was around. Making my husband find out about the missing car was going to be the last straw. But first I had to put my husband's personal trainer and me in a compromising position that my husband would see with his clear eyes. I got my opportunity after one of my husband's training sessions was over. I had worn a moderately seductive dress and positioned myself at the space between the door of the kitchen and the entrance of our home gym space, hoping my husband would be able to see it clearly and banking on the fact that his personal trainer wouldn't be able to resist touching me in the open. I was right on all counts. My husband's personal trainer squeezed my boobs the same time my husband got to the door of the gym entrance, and I screamed at the same time. My acting had been top-notch at that moment, and I thought I would definitely get a star role if I applied for an acting gig. Well, my husband got livid as planned and almost ended up in a fight with his personal trainer, if not I had come in the middle of both of them. 2 days after the incident, my husband finally noticed his car had gone missing, and I once again suggested his trainer had probably stolen it from right under our nose. With that, my husband filed for the arrest of his personal trainer. Of course, I had been smart to place photocopies of the car documents and the minor things I had made go missing in his possession for everything to look real. If you had told me 3 months ago that I would find myself in this position battling with lies, bank loans, minor thefts, and police involvement, I would have called you a liar. But that's where I had seen myself, my fellow Redditors. At least my problems were finally over. I didn't know how wrong I was. My problems were far from over. A while after the involvement with his personal trainer, I woke up to divorce papers from my husband. He had served me divorce papers and had left the house for me. So I couldn't even approach him to ask what had gone wrong or what had happened all of a sudden. Since the squat with his personal trainer, we had been cool and had been as we once were before he began traveling again. I could tell he missed traveling, but he had never said anything about it, so I wasn't worried. But how could that have brought on a divorce? I could say that was one of the least things I was expecting to happen to me and my husband. After all I had done not to lose him, I was going to end up losing him. I had literally been perfect. I had been the perfect wife, the perfect companion, the perfect lover. I had put him on a high pedestal and done everything I knew as a way of apologizing. Well, I had done everything except telling him what I had actually done in the first place. I had done it all not to lose him. And somehow I had lost him. He knew. My husband knew I had cheated on him. That was the reason for the divorce papers. He had found out somehow, and I got to know from his friends who had given me the stink eye treatment, by the way, when I had met up with them to ask if they knew about my husband's whereabouts. He had told all of them the reason he was leaving me. He had told everyone except me. How had he found out? That's what I wondered all the way back from his friend's place. I didn't even think about the sour treatment they had displayed to me. I deserved it, but I also deserved to hear the reason for a divorce from my husband. His personal trainer had definitely gotten to him. There was no other way my husband would have found out except through that route. This was revenge for getting him arrested, surely. My husband's personal gym trainer was getting back at me. Everything had just gone from uphill to downhill in the blink of an eye. A week later, my husband's lawyer came personally to deliver another divorce paper in the case the previous one had gone missing and informed me my husband needed it signed and out of his house before he took drastic action. That had been the most heartbreaking news I had received in a while. I didn't have any other place to stay and my husband knew it. If he was doing this, it meant he didn't care if I was homeless. He just wanted me gone. It was one of the worst days of my life, and I regretted ever giving in to the devilish temptation that came from loneliness. My savings were gone, my jewelries had all been pawned. I had nothing. I was going back to the start because of one mistake. I had never been more disappointed in myself at the time. Well, I signed the papers because I didn't have a choice. The signing of the papers had a time limit. But I made one final request before I gave away the divorce papers. I wanted to hand them over to my husband directly. We had a lot to talk about. Even though I had been the one that had caused our whole marriage to crash, he had a role to play too. And I wanted to talk to him about it. So my husband's lawyer set it up. I was quite adamant on the meeting. My husband thought he could get rid of me that easily without confronting how the whole problem had began in the first place. His business trips had caused majority of our problems and his refusal to acknowledge it. The meeting day came and I walked into my husband's lawyer's office to find my husband already waiting. Speak of the devil who looked calm and collected. Well, he didn't have his whole life thrown away in his face. He didn't know what it was like. Well, I couldn't blame him. I had dug my grave, right? I sat and my husband's lawyer left us to give us privacy to talk. That was how I found out my husband knew all along that I had cheated on him. Right from the second time I had invited his personal trainer to his bed, he had known. So all the games I had been playing, he knew it for what it was. It was like I was living in a fairy tale as my husband narrated everything from his point of view. According to him, he had come home early from one of his trips in an Uber and not his main car and had seen his personal trainer leave the house. That was also the time I had walked to the balcony looking disheveled and well slept with, and he had put two and two together, but he couldn't just jump into conclusions. So he watched us. All the while I had thought he had been on a trip. He had been watching our activities and managed to find out his trainer had been coming into the house on days he wasn't supposed to. My husband narrated that was how he had ended up in the hospital, all because of me. He had said he had wanted to end it all then, however he had to gather enough evidence and see if I would come clean and tell him I had cheated on him while he was gone. That's how he had come back home to watch us from a closer perspective. He knew about his personal trainer's advances towards me, but he hadn't done anything because it looked like I was enjoying it. He had gotten rid of his personal trainer and brought him back to watch me squirm and try to hide my mistake. All he had just wanted was for me to admit what I had done, but I had continued to keep mute and pretend everything was okay, and lying through my nose. He knew about the blackmails from his personal trainer, the jewelry I had pawned, the bank and the loan, and his car I had used as collateral which he had gotten back from the bank. And I had thought I was sleek. He knew about all the missing stuff I had planted on his personal trainer just to get him arrested, and he had played along. He had thought that maybe with his trainer gone I would finally tell him that I had cheated, but still I didn't say anything until he couldn't take it anymore. He had given me so many chances to convince him that what had happened had been a mistake. He knew he had played a role with all the business trips and all the times he had left me alone knowing the only friends I had were his and I couldn't go to them on my own. That was why he had given so many chances, but I had decided to sweep it under the rug, and that was what he couldn't accept, and decided he couldn't stay married to me. To say I was weak after my husband finished narrating his views of the events of the past 2+ months was an understatement. I was drained to say the least. He had given me so many opportunities to come clean and I hadn't. I had kept quiet out of fear of losing him, and I had lost him in the end. All my planning and craftiness to avoid being cast aside, and here I was going through the exact thing I had feared. I narrated my own point of the whole ordeal to him and told him how sorry I was that this was happening to us. I knew there was no chance of him taking me back, and I had learnt my lesson greatly. I handed over the divorce papers and left with my pride before I threw it to the wind and begged him to let me stay and how we could still make our marriage work. That story of my life was over and done with, and there wasn't going to be any going back. Well, I became a single woman living in a very tiny studio room and working for a media agency 3 months later. I still missed my husband, and of course I still regretted that day with every fiber of my being. But what's done had been done, and I just had to get through my day one step at a time. However, a certain someone wasn't done with me. My husband's personal trainer made his debut back into my life once again 4 months later. It was scary when he had attacked me on my way back from work, threatening to tell my boss what I truly was. A job I had just gotten a month ago. Well, I wasn't scared for the job because the next 2 nights I found my room thoroughly scattered with pictures of our night together glued to the walls. It was time to file for a restraining order against him before he puts me under the knife or poisons me out of spite. I went to the police station to do that, and my ex-husband came in after I had filed the report. Apparently, he was still listed as my emergency contact. We talked with no bad vibes between us, and it was refreshing to see we could start over as friends. I never saw his personal trainer again after I filed a restraining order. Everything was finally all right in my world, somehow. I didn't have my husband, but I had his forgiveness, and I had my life at peace once more. Well, Redditors, thank you for sharing my experience with me. I know I had deserved everything that had come to me, but finally I had learned to appreciate everything I had. I started learning to be in a better place with myself and the people around me. I began learning to value relationships from this experience, and also how to speak up and avoid mistakes. I also started therapy, so yay! No more tempting situations for me again. I'm learning how to always control myself. My ex-husband and I sometimes still meet up once in a while or just come across each other in a cafe or in a KFC franchise. I pray I get to experience love like my ex-husband had shown me. I know for certain I wouldn't fumble it this time like I had done with my ex-husband. It's not every day you get to meet your person. I hope you all have learned a thing or two from my experience. The person you may think you're trying to protect by not telling them the truth will definitely appreciate it more when you let them in. You may be trying hard not to lose someone and end up doing what pushes so far away. So please learn from my cheating mistake, and I hope none of you gets to go through my experience.
Bye,
Redditors.